Pict feeds recovered from deep Imperial archives show a sequence of low-resolution field recordings, eyewitness vox logs, and silence-logged custodian transmissions pieced together beneath the palace itself. The images lack ceremony: a child's hand beside a crudely hewn hearth, a blurred procession of pale faces on a rain-dark plain, a sun-scorched skull set against cracked earth. A farmer's eyewitness report, recorded and redacted, speaks in measured tones of a man who stopped a warlord by walking between them, and men fell silent as if some unseen law had been read aloud. It is variously described as coldly resolved or inhumanly compassionate. These fragments, recorded by observers who would later serve under new banners or die in nameless skirmishes, converge only in one way: the earliest impressions of the figure who would become the centre of the human polity that rules the galaxy. The Emperor of mankind's earliest life, as compiled in modern archival summaries and primary Horus heresy material, resists a single, tidy narrative. Canon sources present a mosaic where fact, authorial framing, and deliberate obfuscation intersect. Scholarly treatment therefore treats several propositions cautiously: that his waking into history dates to a prehistoric age, that his emergence was accompanied by extraordinary psychic awareness, and that human traditions later conflated or mythologized those origins. In terms of personal identity, confirmed sources refrain from providing a birth name or familial background. The preponderance of historical data begins only at the point where he surfaces as a dominant unifying force on Terra. Earlier accounts, apocryphal in nature, propose names such as Neoth, attributed to him in fragments of legend and early myth. These sources suggest that Neoth may have been a name used during his activity prior to recorded history, though no definitive confirmation exists. Such references are treated as cultural artifacts rather than verified biography, providing insight into humanity's need to conceptualize the Emperor's presence in mythic terms. Descriptions of early actions emphasize both intellectual and physical capabilities. Archival studies suggest he possessed unparalleled strategic vision, an ability to anticipate the actions of multiple factions simultaneously, and proficiency in technologies that predate the majority of surviving human knowledge. Some records hint at early mastery of psychic disciplines, though the specifics remain undocumented. These abilities appear to have been applied systematically, often indirectly, to stabilize regions, implement administrative structures, and ensure long-term sustainability. One older tradition describes him as the New Man, born in the 8th millennium BC on ancient Terra. In this telling, the Emperor's birth was not merely a normal birth, but the culmination of arcane ritual, a conclave of powerful human psychers, shamans, foreseeing the dangers posed by the warp, decided to pool their psychic souls. Many of them committed mass suicide at once, their souls transferred into the warp, from which they were destined to reincarnate. Their collective soul energy manifested as a single echoing rebirth, not a reincarnated individual, but a new man. This being, the first human to combine all that psychic potential, was the Emperor. According to this narrative, the newborn Emperor entered the world among mortal parents in a primitive Proto-Hittite village on the banks of the Sakarya River in central Anatolia, modern-day Turkey. As a youth, he manifested powers that set him apart. The lore paints an early defining moment. While still an adolescent, his father was murdered by his uncle. When preparing for the burial rites, the young boy was granted a vision. He saw the murder as it had happened. Later he confronted his uncle and, using psychic power, stopped his uncle's heart, killing him without apparent emotion. According to the Emperor's own retelling, that was the instant he understood humanity's essential need for order, for law, and for a single guiding will. After that event, steeped in death, justice, and revelation, the Emperor abandoned his village. He journeyed to what ancient humanity would call the First City, believed to be one of the earliest Sumerian city-states in ancient Mesopotamia. From there, according to later lore, he began to walk among humanity not as a lord, but as an observer, a hidden guardian, shaping history from the shadows while accumulating knowledge, honing his psychic gifts, and preparing for something greater. Over countless centuries, his understanding of humanity deepened, his psychic powers matured. He came to see the dangers of the warp, the immaterial realm feeding off humanity's beliefs and emotions. He recognized that human conflict, primitive superstition, and widespread chaos were feeding those dangers. Thus, his mission transformed, not simply to guide humanity, but to prepare humanity, to unify it, to safeguard it. Yet, even within the lore, this early life narrative is not regarded as strictly canonical. The version of his early history involving the shamans and the Proto-Hittite village is often labelled apocryphal. More recent accounts treat the time before the late 3rd millennium of Terra's chronicle, the period before what would later be called the Unification Wars, as effectively unknown. From a strict canon viewpoint, the first time the Emperor surfaces in reliable records is at the end of the Age of Strife on Terra, where humanity had fractured into warring enclaves. At that time, he appears as one of many warlords struggling for dominance. In that period, known as the Unification Wars, the Emperor is referred to under titles such as Master of the Lines. He steered campaigns across fractured regions, using a blend of gene tech work, what would later culminate in the Thunder Warriors, and ultimately the Space Marines, plus social engineering to bring Terra under his centralized authority. Because of this, any claim about his childhood name, exact birthplace, or family lineage must be regarded with healthy skepticism. They derive from the older, more mythic layer of Warhammer lore, a layer that many modern sources treat as folklore or legend rather than documented history. If we accept the older stories merely as mythic origin hypothesis, then the Emperor's early life appears as the birth of a proto-superhuman consciously crafted by ancient psychics, born in a remote village, orphaned by murder, reshaped by psychic destiny, then wandering early humanity to guide it from behind the scenes. If we accept only what's still regarded as robust lore, his early life remains unrecorded until he erupts onto the scene in the later Age of Strife as a warlord. For a character and a myth as vast as the Emperor, perhaps that ambiguity is intentional. The mystery around his origins reflects the gulf between what humanity knows and what remains forever hidden, and maybe realism in myth demands such shadows. The first major phase of his activity on Terra is commonly labelled in modern historiography as the Unification Wars. During that era, a patchwork of warlords, techno-barbarians, and theocratic enclaves controlled swathes of the planet. The Emperor applied a mixture of direct military force, statecraft, and technological intervention to centralize authority. He made use of prototype soldiers known as the Thunder Warriors, who were effective but ultimately expendable prototypes destined to be succeeded by a more refined form of superhuman soldier. The Thunder Warriors accomplished immediate objectives for territorial consolidation, but were later superseded and systematically retired as the Emperor's programs matured. With political consolidation largely achieved, he redirected resources and knowledge toward genetic and technological programs intended to produce stable, long-lived, and cohesive military formations for use in broader campaigns beyond Terra. This period, recorded by chroniclers and explored at length in Horus Heresy fiction, marks the transition from a single-planet strategy to an interstellar one, motivated by his stated aim of reclaiming and safeguarding human worlds scattered across the galaxy. The Primarch project occupies a central place in that transition. Its conceptual architecture was to seed the galaxy with genetically engineered leaders born to command, each designed as a paragon for a larger legion of soldiers. Gene seed and design templates for the Space Marine legions were developed from samples and from biological work that matured during the Unification era. The Primarch experiment, as recorded in primary narrative sources, did not proceed without failure or complication. The intended 20 prototypes were scattered across space under circumstances that narrators attribute to forces beyond immediate comprehension. The dispersal of those progeny produced the subsequent structure of the Great Crusade, in which recovered Primarchs returned to Terra, took up leadership over legions, and executed the Emperor's program of human reunification on a galactic scale. While the precise mechanics of the Primarch dispersal are described differently across sources, the functional effect is consistent. The Emperor equipped himself with genetically matched leaders and legions that could project force and administer new systems of compliance across reclaimed worlds. The historical and narrative record emphasizes that the Emperor's methods combined technological mastery with a coercive clarity of purpose. He sought to eliminate superstition and institutionalize rational governance under a central human authority. To accomplish these goals, he created instruments that were both bureaucratic and martial. His early administrative reforms on Terra laid the foundation for the later Imperial apparatus. His martial program supplied the forces that would become the engines of the Great Crusade. The language of later historians varies. Some portray these acts as necessary reconstruction following the Old Knight's collapse. Others frame them as the early exercises of an autocrat who placed ends above local autonomy. Critical appraisals in modern commentaries tend to balance these interpretations by focusing on observable outcomes: rapid reunification of Terra, the formation of disciplined transplanetary forces, and the projection of power that followed. The consequences of those outcomes, cultural homogenization, the eclipse of older technologies in favor of controlled repositories, and the centralization of religious and political authority around the personage of the Emperor, are enduring subjects of scholarly debate within both in-universe archives and extramural study. Biographically precise details of his childhood and maturation remain contested. The Horus Heresy corpus provides specific scenes of a young mind awakening to a broader cognizance, learning to control and channel psychic phenomena, and confronting immediate brutality at a personal level. These narrative scenes offer texture, familial loss, early demonstrations of an uncanny aptitude for manipulating human affairs, and an emergent refusal to accept the fragmented state of human societies. Yet readers and analysts must treat these passages as partial, often authored with an eye toward thematic balance within larger novels. Many scholars therefore annotate the accounts with cautionary notes, identifying which episodes are explicit in primary Horus Heresy texts and which derive from earlier supplemental materials that have since been reinterpreted. The upshot for the historian is familiarity with both the descriptive scenes and their contested status. The Emperor appears in the records as a figure who combined pragmatic organization with a nearly unmatched psychic potency, approached events with a long-term plan, and accepted morally fraught decisions as instruments of a singular strategy. By the time he prepared to extend human dominion beyond Terra, the Emperor had consolidated the prerequisites for a sustained interstellar effort. His forces, refined science, and political design coalesced into the Great Crusade, an enterprise that sought both to recover lost human worlds and to bring the galaxy under a unified human governance. The organizational logic of the Crusade relied upon the Primarch-led legions as vectors of both military conquest and administrative imposition. Records show that the Crusade combined acts of warfare, negotiated compliance, and the establishment of new systems of governance on reclaimed planets. Some campaigns were short and administrative in nature, aiming to fold isolated communities into the Imperium's logistics networks. Others were prolonged military operations that confronted alien species, rival human polities, or localized cults of technology and belief. The scale of the operation, as the compiled sources attest, was unprecedented and set the conditions for subsequent ideological schisms among those tasked with executing the Emperor's design. Scholarly consensus within modern analyses of the material emphasizes two enduring points. First, the figure at the center of these developments is consistently represented as possessing capacities that far exceed ordinary human aptitude: mastery of warfare, capacity for psychic manipulation at scale, and the political will to remake societies. Second, the precise metaphysical origins of those capacities remain a subject of contested interpretation. Contemporary historiography therefore treats origin narratives as layered. Early background texts offer one set of images. Horus Heresy novels develop psychological and historical texture, and later syntheses leave certain questions open by design. The aim of this chapter's opening record is not to adjudicate among those theories, but to set a restrained, archival baseline. The man who undertook planetary unification created the institutional and genetic instruments that would project human power across the stars and then set in motion events that would crescendo into wider conflict, is the subject now named in Imperial liturgy and scholarly footnotes as the Emperor of Mankind. The descriptions that survive regarding the Emperor's physical and functional traits come from a mixture of battlefield accounts, custodial memoranda, and later Imperial analyses attempting to document a being whose nature cannot be cleanly compared to any known biological category. Although the earliest pick captures depict only silhouettes and poorly preserved images, later records from the Unification era onward establish the consistent pattern of his appearance. Witnesses describe an individual of exceptional height, surpassing even the most enhanced warriors created in later centuries. Estimates taken from standardized armor silhouettes recorded by custodian notaries place him at a height of 14 feet or 4.3 meters, with proportions that suggested strength far beyond baseline humans. His frame carried both the mass and symmetry of deliberate genetic design despite originating from a period predating the technologies he would later create. Skin tone is consistently described as bronze and burnt umber. Hair is recorded as dark, long, brown hair, often depicted as windswept or flowing, sometimes with an angelic halo. His eyes are often intensely golden, often glowing with immense psychic power, capable of blinding foes, driving them mad, and granting visions of the future. These physical descriptors, however, only serve as an entry point into traits that cannot be captured by biological language alone. Numerous accounts emphasize the presence he exerted, a pressure or resonance that individuals felt without conscious interpretation. This was attributed by scholars to the refined psychic capability he possessed. Unlike standard human psykers, whose abilities are unstable, broadly dangerous, and often unpredictable, the Emperor's psychic discipline was presented as perfectly controlled, refined, and silent. Researchers studying archived testimony point out that even in proximity to catastrophic warp anomalies, he is depicted as operating with full command of his faculties, exerting influence on physical and immaterial domains with a stability never replicated by later generations or by engineered transhumans. During the Unification era, soldiers frequently reported the sensation of fear falling away in his presence, as if their biological responses were muted by an external force. Conversely, enemy commanders described sudden waves of despair or a sense of inevitable defeat. These observations, consistently identified throughout different campaigns, support scholarly interpretations that the Emperor did not merely possess psychic ability. He applied it with deliberate restraint or controlled intensity depending on strategic need. Other traits noted repeatedly include exceptional speed, endurance, and cognitive processing far beyond human standards. Custodians who served near him during high-level operations recorded that he could evaluate vast volumes of information within seconds, integrating tactical, political, and technological data without visible effort. Some classified segments recovered from Great Crusade-era logs mention his ability to predict events, with an accuracy suggesting a fusion of psychic foresight and logical projection. These descriptions do not frame him as omniscient, but as extraordinarily effective at identifying the trajectory of events long before others recognized the pattern. More importantly, this predictive talent influenced his organizational strategies, centralizing authority, creating genetically bonded legions, and shaping institutions that would last beyond his direct presence, were choices born from this long-view perspective. Analysts note that these traits, heightened intellect, controlled psychic force, exceptional physical capability, and a capacity for strategic foresight, form the stable core of his distinctive characteristics. The Emperor's traits, however, cannot be separated from the role he assumed in conflict. He fought as both a commander and a direct combatant. This duality is recorded as part of his identity. He led vast armies, yet also entered battlefields personally when strategic necessity demanded it. Consequently, weapons and equipment associated with him reflect not ceremonial symbolism, but functional tools suited to an individual whose capabilities exceeded those of any soldier at his disposal. His most widely recognized weapon is the blade known as the Sword of the Emperor, sometimes called the Great Sword or simply the weapon crafted under his direct supervision. Sources differ on whether it was fully forged by his own hand or engineered through collaboration with artisans and technologists capable of working with exotic materials. The consistent description identifies it as a masterwork power blade, larger than any standard field model and resonant with an energy signature that astropaths later identified as unique. Whether this resonance was a byproduct of psychic infusion or advanced technology remains an open subject in Imperial scholarship. The blade is referenced during multiple Great Crusade operations, described slicing through hostile constructs, power armor, and alien materials that otherwise resisted conventional weaponry. Its size and balance were said to be optimized specifically for the Emperor's strength, making it a tool that no other warrior could wield efficiently. The Emperor also carried a personal armor system, most often referred to in modern compendia as the master-crafted warplate. Unlike later suits worn by Primarchs or transhuman warriors, his armor is represented as a singular design, neither standardized nor replicated across any known Imperial line. It combined psychic shielding, environmental regulation, and high-energy absorption plates constructed from advanced materials whose manufacturing processes were either lost after the Age of Strife or deliberately restricted. The armor's visual profile, reconstructed from ceremonial depictions and functional field records, consists of a layered combination of articulated plating, integrated energy conductors, and stability systems designed to support his immense physical output. Scholars sometimes categorize the suit as a superior counterpart to the artificer armor used by elite commanders, although this comparison reflects only a structural similarity. The Emperor's armor was unique in both origin and performance. It is described as capable of withstanding impacts that would destroy armored vehicles, dispersing kinetic and thermal energy in ways beyond the reach of even the most advanced mechanicum technologies of the era. Additional gear associated with the Emperor varied depending on the operation. During high-intensity conflicts, he occasionally employed a secondary psychic weapon or technological device aligned with warp channeling functions. These instruments, referenced briefly in Horus Heresy literature, are described with caution by scholars because their exact specifications remain uncertain. Some texts suggest that he used a form of psychic amplifier integrated into his armor. Others describe an object resembling a staff or control rod designed to stabilize environmental warp energy. The lack of consensus suggests that multiple tools existed but were deployed selectively. What remains consistent is the general principle. The Emperor used gear designed to interface with his psychic abilities and enhance battlefield control when conditions required it. His distinctive traits also extended into behavior and decision-making patterns. The Emperor was noted for his calm presence and his ability to maintain composure even during catastrophic events. Primarchs, custodians, and civilian witnesses alike observed that he rarely displayed visible emotion during strategic deliberations. This absence should not be interpreted as coldness in the traditional sense. Rather, analysts describe it as a sign of strict self-regulation. His focus remained on long-term stability, the advancement of his unified human project, and the minimization of large-scale suffering, achieved through methods that often required difficult or morally complex decisions. This functional restraint allowed him to operate as a strategist without the volatility that affected many of the Primarchs later shaped from his own genetic material. Throughout the Great Crusade, the Emperor interacted with an extremely broad range of human populations and Xenos entities. Reports note that his bearing, voice, and physical presence tended to override local customs, creating an immediate shift in the psychological state of those who encountered him. Whether this effect stemmed from controlled psychic projection or from the natural influence of his engineered physiology remains a topic of scholarly debate. Some analysts argue that he presented an idealized form recognizable by all human cultures, thereby reducing resistance to his authority. Others contend that his psychic fields subtly stabilized emotional responses in nearby individuals, reducing fear and defensive impulses. Both interpretations align with observational data. Individuals near him reported clarity, confidence, and a sense of security rarely found in the chaos of the era. The distinctive traits of the Emperor also manifested in the way he shaped institutions. His genetic mastery, technological expertise, and administrative design all reflected a unified vision. He understood the shortcomings of humanity after the Age of Strife and engineered solutions across multiple domains simultaneously. Biologically, he created transhuman warriors capable of surviving environments that baseline humans could not. Politically, he established structures that integrated conquered worlds into a system of governance that could endure beyond his direct oversight. Technologically, he revived knowledge lost during Old Night and standardized systems of manufacturing and warfare that supported the expansion of the Imperium. All of these actions displayed a trait consistent across the entire historical record. He operated with a singular purpose that guided every decision. This purpose, restoring human civilization to stability and dominance, was the central axis of his identity. Returning to the subject of weapons and equipment, another notable item associated with the Emperor is his personal gauntlet system, sometimes described in sources as an energy-projecting mechanism integrated into his armour. While less iconic than his greatsword, the gauntlet played a significant role in certain engagements, delivering focused bursts of energy or controlling environmental phenomena in ways that combined psychic and technological functions. Some historians argue that this gauntlet was not a singular device, but rather a modular system he adapted depending on mission parameters. Its functionality appears similar to high-output power fields or telekinetic amplifiers later developed by the Mechanicum, but the Emperor's version remains unparalleled in both stability and raw output. Accounts from the Great Crusade also document instances where the Emperor fought without weapons, relying solely on his physical and psychic capabilities. These moments demonstrate his mastery over both the material and immaterial domains. Opponents described being immobilized, disoriented, or overwhelmed before physical contact was made. Witnesses occasionally reported environmental disturbances such as temperature shifts, pressure changes, or even momentary silence as if sound itself had been displaced. Scholars attribute these effects to the Emperor's psychic manipulation of localized space, though the exact mechanisms remain unclear. The common thread in these records is that he possessed the ability to end conflicts through force that appeared effortless, underscoring the unique nature of his power. His overall appearance, therefore, was defined as much by these intangible qualities as by his armor or weapons. While the artifacts he used carried symbolic power, they primarily served practical functions. Their aesthetic significance developed later as Imperial iconography evolved around them. During the periods in which he directly participated in military operations, these items were tools rather than relics. Only after his ascension to the Golden Throne did the symbols of his weapons and armor become objects of veneration, reproduced in statues, banners, and ceremonial regalia throughout the Imperium. In evaluating the Emperor's distinctive traits, researchers consistently emphasize that no single description sufficiently captures his full profile. Biological superiority, psychic command, intellectual precision, and strategic restraint each formed essential components of his identity. His weapons and armor complemented these traits rather than defining them. The blade, armor, and auxiliary devices he used were extensions of his will, tools engineered or refined to operate at the extreme limits of known science and psychic application. These components highlight the practical reality of his existence. He was a figure shaped for leadership in an era of unprecedented fragmentation, carrying capabilities suited not only to unifying a single world, but to reshaping the future trajectory of an entire species. This combination of traits and tools shaped the Emperor into a singular presence in recorded human history. Every weapon he carried, every artifact engineered for his use, and every strategic decision he made reveals a consistent pattern. He acted with focus, precision, and long-range purpose. The records from his earliest wars on terror through the height of the Great Crusade show an individual who fused immense personal capability with technological and logistical sophistication. These qualities, when taken together, formed the core of what observers recognized as the Emperor of Mankind. The earliest records that attempt to interpret the Emperor's personality rely not on personal testimony, but on fragmented accounts from individuals who interacted with him only briefly. These sources consistently describe a figure who displayed controlled emotion, measured speech, and a manner that conveyed deliberate intention in every action. Even before the unification of terror reached its midpoint, observers recognized that his temperament did not align with ordinary human patterns. He did not express frustration in the way warlords or political leaders typically did. He did not elevate his voice for authority or rely on outward displays of aggression. His presence was steady, marked by clarity and the sense that every word he spoke had already been considered from multiple angles before it left his lips. This controlled demeanor was not interpreted as detachment, but as the product of a mind accustomed to perceiving consequences far ahead of the moment. Many scholars analyzing early accounts explain his composure as a reflection of deep cognitive structure. He possessed a form of emotional governance that appeared innate rather than learned, enabling him to separate immediate feelings from long-term considerations. During early negotiations with techno-barbarian factions, he was described as calm even when confronted with hostility, responding with concise explanations of his goals and intentions, rather than engaging in displays of dominance. Witnesses later recognized that this restraint was not passivity. It was an intentional effort to minimize unnecessary bloodshed, while guiding the conversation toward outcomes beneficial to humanity as a whole. In private, according to custodian recollections preserved in later logs, the Emperor maintained a consistent tone that neither softened for comfort nor sharpened for reprimand. His interactions with those who served him followed a pattern of clarity and directive purpose. He explained objectives with precision, ensured that subordinates understood the rationale behind major initiatives, and expected competence without demanding loyalty through fear. Individuals who study these accounts point out that his personality was built upon a foundation of rationality so refined that emotion became secondary to structured decision-making. This does not imply a lack of feeling. Rather, his emotions existed within a framework he controlled, never overpowering the strategic calculations that defined his leadership. Another dimension of his personality emerges through his interactions with cultures that resisted integration. During the Great Crusade, the Emperor often approached new civilizations with offers of unity, cooperation, and technological uplift. Records indicate that he preferred diplomatic assimilation over conquest whenever possible. He employed reason, evidence, and historical analysis to persuade leaders of the benefits of joining a unified humanity. When negotiations failed or when hostile entities refused cooperation, he shifted to decisive military action. This shift was always portrayed as a last resort, not a preferred method. Imperial archivists analyzing this pattern identify it as evidence of a personality grounded in pragmatism. He chose the method that would reduce long-term instability rather than the method that would satisfy short-term objectives. Interactions with the Primarchs offer additional insight into his temperament. Despite creating them as strategic instruments designed to expand the Imperium, he treated each of them according to their developmental needs and personalities. His communications with them reveal patience, analytical attention, and a long-term intention to instill discipline, unity, and shared purpose. Yet scholars note that he did not demonstrate overt paternal affection in the way a contemporary observer might define it. His approach was clinical in some areas and supportive in others, revealing a personality shaped not by emotional bonding, but by responsibility toward the future of humanity. The Primarchs were essential components of his design for a unified species, and he sought to guide them in ways that aligned them with the overarching project. When examining his organizational alignment, historians consistently identify a pattern that spans centuries of recorded activity. The Emperor constructed systems intended to endure beyond his lifetime. Every institution he built was designed with layered hierarchy, logical distribution of authority, and redundancy to minimize collapse. The administrative structures of the early Imperium were drafted with levels of oversight capable of managing thousands of worlds. The military forces created under his direction, particularly the Legiones Astartes, were structured to function independently yet cohesively, enabling rapid deployment across vast distances without constant oversight from the Imperial center. These choices reflect a personality oriented toward longevity and sustainability rather than short-term dominance. His alignment with technological advancement also reveals a central facet of his identity. The Emperor valued knowledge and technical progress, often intervening directly to ensure preservation of vital scientific understanding. During the Age of Strife, much of humanity's technological capability had fragmented or been lost entirely. In response, he sought both to recover and to standardize key mechanisms, encouraging the Mechanicum to collaborate with the broader Imperium while maintaining a careful balance between cooperation and oversight. Although the relationship between the Emperor and the Mechanicum occasionally contained points of friction, his overarching intent was clear. Technology must serve humanity rather than dominate it. This alignment also extended into psychic regulation. Recognizing the dangers inherent in uncontrolled psychic development, he instituted systems to identify, train, or contain psykers to prevent catastrophic warp incidents. Records from this period emphasize that he viewed psychic potential as both a resource and a threat. His personality approached the matter with clinical caution, establishing institutions that prioritize safety while still harnessing the benefits of psychic discipline. The creation of the Astronomicon and stable methods of warp communication further reflected his intention to integrate psychic capability into the infrastructure of the Imperium in a controlled manner. In assessing the Emperor's personality through the lens of strategic alignment, one sees an individual who operated with a consistent framework. Humanity must survive, stabilize, and advance. This objective governed every organizational choice he made. Whether constructing legislation, designing genetic enhancements, arranging logistical networks, or establishing the foundations of imperial governance, he calibrated each decision to support the long-term viability of the human species. Even when his actions appeared severe, such as during campaigns against hostile human factions, historians note that these measures were not expressions of cruelty, but the result of calculating the potential collapse of civilization if fragmentation persisted. Despite this structured approach, the Emperor exhibited adaptability when necessary. He adjusted strategies in response to new information, altered political approaches when dealing with divergent cultural groups, and reconfigured logistical operations when conditions shifted. This adaptability did not undermine his overarching plan. Instead, it reinforced his ability to maintain direction while navigating complex and evolving circumstances. Analysts studying his decision-making describe it as fluid within a rigid architecture. The long-term strategy remained constant, but the route toward achieving it could shift depending on environmental, political, or technological variables. Personal accounts from the Great Crusade also indicate that the Emperor possessed a sense of purpose that rarely faltered. Soldiers who fought under him described an individual who inspired confidence not through emotional speeches but through clarity of mission. He communicated expectations with minimal embellishment, specifying goals and outcomes without appealing to fear or glory. This minimalism reflected a personality rooted in results rather than theatrics. His consistent demeanor conveyed reliability, convincing those under his command that even the most daunting objectives were attainable. Regarding social interactions, civilian populations exposed to him recorded impressions of reassurance, stability, and structure. In regions recovering from the devastation of Old Night, this influence was especially significant. Many reported the sense that he understood the traumatic history humanity had endured and sought to provide a foundation that prevented such collapse from returning. His personality, therefore, was not only strategic and administrative but also stabilizing. He shaped environments that supported long-term recovery through governance, infrastructure, and consistent oversight. His alignment with the concept of unity formed the cornerstone of his ideology. He viewed humanity as a species fragmented by millennia of isolation, war, and technological regression. This fragmentation represented not only political division, but existential risk. The Emperor believed that a unified species could withstand external threats, maintain internal stability, and pursue advancement in a coordinated manner. Therefore, his personality aligned with an overarching ideal: unity as the prerequisite for survival. Every institution he built, every campaign he led, and every reform he enacted reflected this alignment. It defined the structures of the Imperium, influenced the design of the legions, and shaped the socio-political landscape of the Great Crusade. The more controversial aspects of his personality arise when analysing decisions that produced long-term consequences. Some scholars argue that his strategic detachment prevented him from fully anticipating the psychological complexities of certain Primarchs, while others contend that he weighed such risks against the broader necessity of rapid expansion. These analyses do not suggest personal oversight, but demonstrate that even a being of extraordinary capability faced constraints when managing genetically enhanced individuals with distinct temperaments and immense power. The Emperor's calm and structured decision-making could not eliminate the unpredictability that arose from independent agency among his creations. This does not diminish his personality traits, but highlights the limitations imposed by scale, complexity, and divergent psychology. In considering final analysis of Chapter 1's themes, the Emperor's personality emerges as a blend of extraordinary restraint, deep foresight, and strategic rationality. He was not driven by ego or personal desire for dominance. His decisions consistently supported the long-term stability of the species rather than individual glorification. This personality structure enabled him to approach governance with a degree of precision unmatched by any leader of the era. His alignment with scientific advancement, political unity, and controlled psychic development reflects a comprehensive understanding of the forces shaping human survival. His organizational alignment stands as a reflection of this mindset. He crafted institutions designed for durability, efficiency, and integration. His systems of governance, warfare, and technological oversight were arranged to sustain humanity across thousands of worlds, navigating both internal pressures and external threats. These structures were not temporary measures, but long-term frameworks intended to persist beyond his direct presence. The enduring nature of these institutions demonstrates the accuracy of his long-term planning and the consistency of his organizational philosophy. In concluding this segment, the Emperor of Mankind can be understood as an individual whose personality and organizational choices were inseparable. His temperament shaped his empire, and the empire in turn reflected the structured, rational, forward-focused qualities that defined him. His personality fostered stability, his institutions enforced coherence, and his strategic vision sought to position humanity not merely as a surviving species, but as a dominant, unified force capable of navigating the challenges of the galaxy. His influence resonates across every aspect of Imperial history because he constructed systems that mirrored his internal architecture, resilient, orderly, intentional, and fueled by the conviction that humanity could rise above the fractured remnants of old night. This foundation, built from his unique traits and unwavering vision, created the framework through which all subsequent Imperial developments would unfold. Even after his physical form ceased active participation, the structures he established continue to operate within the framework of his design, demonstrating the profound connection between the Emperor's character and the civilization he forged. The earliest surviving records attributed to the Adeptus Administratum treat the Emperor less as an individual and more as an administrative constant, a stabilizing value that remains unchanged in every recalibration of Imperial history. Within their preserved file data cores, even the pre-unification era fragments show a consistent pattern. Whenever regional authorities attempted to quantify his presence, The resulting data reduced the margins of unpredictability across entire population clusters. Administratum analysts describe this as a statistical anomaly so stable that it cannot be replicated by any mortal leader. They note that the fluctuating tide of Terra's ancient clans, shifting borders, and decaying infrastructures became markedly more ordered whenever he acted, even before he publicly declared his ambitions for global unity. In the archived words of an administratum lexicographer, the presence of the Emperor converted chaos into solvable arithmetic. Though phrased in a way typical for that institution, their meaning is clear. To the administratum, his defining quality was that he made the impossible bureaucratically feasible. When the Unification Wars escalated to their largest continental offensives, reports from administratum field auditors describe a recurring pattern of logistical compression that followed his campaigns. Routes that had been impassable for centuries became viable within days. Populations that historical models predicted would resist conscription instead folded into his armies without measurable delay. Even drought-plagued regions that lacked stable water distribution systems showed sudden increases in functional output once his forces arrived. The administratum files remain careful not to label these outcomes as miracles. Instead, they classify them as rapid systemic recalibrations initiated by unknown precursor factors, a phrase that appears more than 200 times across the preserved ledgers of that era. In practical terms, the institution saw his strategic footprint as a predictive phenomenon. Wherever he moved, the underlying administrative realities shifted to align with his objectives. The Mechanicus, however, treated these same patterns with a different lens. In their transmissions recovered from Mars, recovered centuries after the Great Crusade began, they categorized the Emperor as an operator of lost scientific disciplines that predated the Old Knight. Their earliest surviving treaty documents, the ones recorded during the establishment of the Treaty of Mars, identify him as not merely a biological form, but an entity capable of interacting with technologies whose origins were believed to lie in the Dark Age of technology. In their internal analyses, Mechanicus logic engine outputs show debate on whether his abilities constituted a biological anomaly, an engineered long-term construct, or a remnant pattern of human potential once common but now extinct. These discussions were eventually sealed, but their shadows remain in the analytical phrasing used in Mechanicus archives. For them, the question was not whether the Emperor was extraordinary. The question was whether he represented a surviving template from a forgotten scientific epoch. Administratum audit logs from the Unification era make frequent reference to the Emperor's ability to coordinate immense human populations with negligible error margins. One calculation attempts to quantify the logistical requirements necessary to mobilize entire regions within minimal timeframes. The result concluded that the probability of achieving such alignment through conventional means was lower than 1 in tens of millions. Yet the Emperor performed these feats repeatedly. His communications with regional leaders rarely required extended negotiations. His strategic projections consistently anticipated the flow of refugees, workforce availability, food distribution, and societal collapse curves. Administratum analysts later retroactively categorized his actions as a mastery of long-horizon assessment, suggesting that he possessed a comprehension of macro-organizational behavior far beyond any known baseline human capability. The Mechanicus, analyzing the same periods, focused on different metrics. They were less concerned with societal stabilization and more with the Emperor's interaction with machines, systems and technologies long considered inert or corrupted. Several sealed data engines recovered from Terran research vaults referenced his presence as a stabilizing factor for machinery derived from the Dark Age. There are mentions of devices that had resisted activation for centuries suddenly achieving functional operation when he issued direct instructions. These records are sparse, heavily redacted, and often intentionally fragmented, but the consistency of the pattern stands out. The Emperor did not simply understand the machines of humanity's past. He commanded them at a fundamental level. Administratum records during the Great Crusade expanded their evaluations to planetary governance. Once the Imperium's expansion began in earnest, the institution observed what they called unprecedented synchronization across multi-world environments. Their files note that compliance rates on newly contacted worlds rose sharply when the Emperor personally oversaw initial diplomatic or military actions. Populations that had resisted external authority for generations submitted after relatively brief periods of contact. The administratum attributed this to his ability to issue directives that aligned with innate human behavioral patterns. They documented that his presence reduced rebellion frequency, lowered civilian casualty projections, and shortened the duration of initial compliance operations. Their calculations refer repeatedly to behavioral harmonization, suggesting they believed the Emperor's influence operated not simply through charisma or intimidation, but through some intrinsic mechanism that shaped collective decision-making. The Mechanicus, meanwhile, recorded that many of the first worlds brought into the Imperium during the Crusade held fragments of ancient technologies still locked behind non-functional systems. In several documented cases, the Emperor was able to interact with these relics in ways no other human could replicate, not even their highest-ranking tech priests. They observed that he communicated with noospheric interfaces without external equipment. He deciphered fragmented machine language sequences that had eluded their cryptographers for centuries. In rare instances, Mechanicus adepts reported that he could instruct machine spirits directly, bypassing the rituals and subroutines that governed standard operations. This capability unsettled many within the cult Mechanicus, who maintained that machine spirits obeyed ritual, not individuals. Their internal notes reveal a mixture of awe and caution. They viewed him as the only living being who could override the centuries of sacred commandments that defined their understanding of technology. Administratum analyses also note the Emperor's unparalleled efficiency in long-term planning. While ordinary Imperial leaders relied on a combination of history, intuition, and counsel, he operated with what the administratum termed perfected multi-layer foresight. Their analytics determined that his decisions consistently produced outcomes that aligned with optimal projections even decades later. Whether he predicted patterns or shaped them remains a topic of debate in their sealed vaults, but the pattern itself is undeniable. These evaluations remain some of the few administratum documents written without qualification or statistical hedging. To them, the Emperor was the closest entity to an absolute constant in the otherwise unpredictable structure of interstellar governance. On the Mechanicus side, their impressions were shaped heavily by the Treaty of Mars. After signing it, they recorded the Emperor as the only human who fully understood the ramifications of the pact. Not because he explained them in detail, but because every provision he negotiated aligned with outcomes that stabilized the long-fractured Martian hierarchy. Mechanicus forecasts indicate that they expected internal conflict following the signing of the treaty. Instead, the opposite occurred. The institution's power consolidated, factional strife decreased, Forge worlds aligned more efficiently. The Emperor's willingness to legitimize the cult Mechanicus as the technological authority of the Imperium produced an equilibrium none of their models had predicted. In their analysis, he not only understood their value but anticipated their future role in maintaining the Imperium's infrastructure across thousands of worlds. Administratum logisticians also recorded the Emperor's ability to mobilize and sustain planetary-scale operations as something that defied ordinary analysis. Their models accounted for fleet movement, supply chain stability, workforce allocation, and long-distance communication delays. Yet his campaigns consistently operated beyond the upper limit of their predicted efficiency. Ammunition supply remained stable even across prolonged interstellar offensives. Food distribution rarely failed despite transporting vast populations across the stars. Civil governance on compliant worlds stabilized far faster than administratum norms. In their long-term data review, they concluded that his strategic planning operated with a degree of precision that no subsequent Imperial leader ever matched. These assessments were later sealed, likely due to the institution's directive to avoid comparisons between the Emperor and any later rulers. Mechanicus analyses of the same era often describe him as a unifying constant between organic and machine domains. Their archives note that he never treated technology as something mystical. To him, It was a tool, powerful, dangerous, but ultimately a human creation. This attitude conflicted with the deepest doctrines of the Mechanicus, who viewed the machine as a divine entity. Yet the Emperor's approach did not produce rebellion or doctrinal collapse. Instead, their files indicate that his perspective exerted a stabilizing influence. Even those tech priests uncomfortable with his rejection of their religious beliefs still acknowledged his mastery of technological systems. They may not have agreed with his understanding of the machine, but they could not challenge his results. Administratum data, after the Great Crusade's midpoint, reveals a more pragmatic shift in their impression of him. As the Imperium expanded and the burden of administration grew heavier, they noted that his attention shifted from the day-to-day logistics of empire building to the far more abstract effort of guiding the Primarchs, reorganizing conquered territories and shaping the overall direction of humanity's destiny. Their files indicate that large segments of the administratum began operating under the assumption that his presence alone provided stability, even if he no longer involved himself in the intricate bureaucratic details. Their calculations reflected a new reality. The Emperor had become a symbolic and analytical foundation upon which all further imperial systems balanced. The Mechanicus recorded a similar shift. During this period, they observed that the Emperor rarely interacted with ancient machines directly. Instead, he delegated more responsibilities to his sons and to the expanding priesthood of Mars. Their internal analyses suggest that they interpreted this change as a sign of his deeper preoccupation with something beyond the physical realm, something they could neither quantify nor easily classify within their logic frameworks. They documented that his noospheric presence, something they claimed to measure in rare circumstances, became more distant yet more intense in its focus. Some Mechanicus savants wrote that it felt as though he was no longer observing the present, but assessing distant possibilities, outcomes, and catastrophic potentials that extended far beyond their computational reach. Administratum and Mechanicus assessments converge on one final point. Both institutions agreed that the Emperor operated at a conceptual level inaccessible to ordinary humans. Administratum analysts describe this as megastructural cognition, the ability to comprehend and manipulate social, political, and military systems on a galactic scale. Mechanicus adepts called it hyperlogical potential, an intellect that exceeded even the most advanced cogitators of the Dark Age. Their terminology differed, but the meaning remained consistent. To both institutions, the Emperor was an anomaly of human existence, someone who redefined what humanity could be, not through ideology, but through unmatched capacity. In their combined evaluations, his presence shaped the Imperium's structure more profoundly than any law, decree, or governance model. Their records suggest that both the Administratum and the Mechanicus saw him not merely as a ruler, but as the core phenomenon around which their respective systems stabilized. Even when he withdrew from direct leadership, the inertia of his earlier actions continued to anchor the Imperium. To the Administratum, he remained the ultimate authority whose decisions shaped the very concept of imperial governance. To the Mechanicus, he remained the singular human who understood the machine without worshipping it. Their impressions, while viewed through different institutional lenses, converge on a shared conclusion. The Emperor was not simply the ruler of humanity, he was the defining axis around which the Imperium's past, present, and projected future revolved. Administratum records from the latter Unification era indicate that the Emperor's early military campaigns were documented with unusual caution. Even the most senior scribes avoided direct commentary on his battlefield presence, instead relying on second-hand logs, expedition reports, and fragmented pict feeds preserved through redundant archival cores. Through these indirect accounts, a consistent image emerges. Whenever the Emperor took the field, the surrounding conflicts shifted into accelerated resolution patterns. Opposing lines collapsed not merely due to superior force, but because the morale structures of entire armies destabilized. Administratum analysts noted that commanders who'd resisted for decades often surrendered within hours of direct contact with him. Their records describe the dissolution of resistance not as panic, but as recognition of futility, as if the logic of continuing the fight simply evaporated in his presence. One of the largest engagements documented during the Unification period occurred during the subjugation of the Pan-Pacific Empire. Administratum logs state that the Pan-Pacific forces deployed extensive gene-enhanced infantry, armoured contingents, and immense coastal fortifications designed to withstand orbital bombardment. Yet the data regarding the Emperor's advance implies that defences built to withstand decades of siege collapsed within days. The battle reports describe him moving continuously at the front of his armies, striking with a precision that disrupted every command chain. Mechanicus overseers assigned to monitor weapon outputs recorded that energy signatures around him spiked far beyond what conventional analysis permitted. They were incapable of categorizing the phenomenon in technological terms. Instead, they classified it as an unknown energetic manipulation, noting that the Emperor's presence distorted the operational readings of nearby augurs and sensor webs. During the concluding stages of the Pan-Pacific campaign, Administratum observers reported that several defensive lines surrendered the moment he breached their perimeter. These capitulations were not attributed to casualties or overwhelming firepower. Instead, they were linked to psychological overload. Troops witnessing his advance abandoned their formations, convinced resistance was irrelevant. Administratum archivists concluded that the Emperor's presence acted as a destabilizing variable on enemy morale, creating collapse scenarios impossible to model through ordinary warfare simulations. Similar patterns are repeated throughout the early Great Crusade. On the world of Goro, where the Emperor personally fought a towering Xenos warlord during the earliest compliance actions, Mechanicus data tracers recorded fluctuations in gravitational force localized around his strikes. The surviving documentation indicates that the warlord was physically larger, stronger, and more resilient than any human baseline, yet the Emperor dispatched him through movements that appeared instantaneous to standard visual equipment. The Administratum categorized this encounter as a high-priority anomaly, noting that the Emperor's physical capabilities consistently exceeded recorded limits, even for gene-enhanced warriors. They concluded that no known human classification system accurately captured his combat potential. The Great Crusade's expansion into Ulanor provides another extensive data set. The Ulanor campaign remained one of the largest military operations of the era, involving an immense Orc empire that had consolidated under a powerful war boss. When the Emperor took direct command of the final offensive, Administratum records show a sudden surge in operational efficiency across all Imperial armies involved in the siege. Communications traffic slowed, casualty projections dropped, and battlefield attrition rates aligned with optimistic projections rather than the far harsher predictions documented in earlier stages. The decisive moment was recorded during the final confrontation, where the Emperor personally slew the Orc warlord atop a fortified plateau surrounded by millions of Orcs. The engagement's sensory logs were corrupted due to interference, but fragments preserved by the Mechanicus show an overwhelming surge of thermal and kinetic output. Many Mechanicus adepts reviewing these fragments concluded that no known weapon present on the field could have been responsible for such readings. They filed the event under non-technological energy expression, further supporting the idea that the Emperor's combat power was not confined to any conventional discipline. Administratum scribes wrote that the Ulanor victory established a historical pivot point. The Emperor's actions there demonstrated that large-scale Xenos empires were not insurmountable threats. His ability to confront and eliminate apex enemies reinforced the perception that the Imperium's expansion was mathematically inevitable, as long as he remained active on the battlefield. These conclusions reinforced morale across countless Crusade fleets and created logistical confidence that shaped future campaign planning. When examining the Emperor's fighting style, both the Administratum and the Mechanicus noted his preference for direct engagement. He positioned himself where the battle was most unstable, driving forward with overwhelming force that often tipped the conflict's momentum instantly. Administratum auditors found that enemy formations targeting him experienced extreme casualty acceleration. Hostile units positioned against his advance routinely collapsed, even when they held numerical superiority. Their conclusion was that his presence exerted both physical and psychological dominance, breaking enemy cohesion by eliminating their leadership structures, while simultaneously overwhelming the will of their rank and file. The Mechanicus documented a different pattern. They recorded that the Emperor's movements defied standard motion tracking. Even advanced sensorium equipment, capable of monitoring rapid combatants such as Thunder Warriors or later Astartes, could not map his trajectory in real time. Their internal discussions debated whether he manipulated electromagnetic fields or gravitational principles, though no consensus was ever reached. One of their sealed logs describes his combat method as multi-vector engagement, implying that he attacked from multiple positional possibilities simultaneously or moved at velocities beyond sensor detection. Their models could not simulate his combat performance using any known technological or biological framework. Another significant battle occurred on the world of Prospero during the conflict between the Emperor and Magnus the Red. Administratum scribes recorded the event as a catastrophic intersection of psychic forces, though most of their files remain sealed under emergency classification. Surviving logistics notes indicate that the Emperor's presence altered the environmental structure of the battlefield, disrupting warp anomalies that had engulfed portions of the planet. The Mechanicus viewed this event as one of the most extreme displays of Emperor-level psychic intervention ever observed. Their data logs show cycles of warp energy collapsing and reforming around his position in patterns they could not categorize. Though direct combat data remained suppressed, both institutions acknowledged that the Emperor possessed absolute control over psychic phenomena when operating at full capacity. The events surrounding the Siege of Terra provide the most extensive archival material. Administratum and Mechanicus observers documented every phase of the conflict with painstaking precision. They both noted that despite the catastrophic scale of the warfare, the Emperor's defensive command produced stability across all concentric layers of Terra's fortifications. His strategic inputs maintained the cohesion of the Imperial palace, even as the traitor legions pressed their full strength against it. Administratum assessment logs indicate that morale across Imperial forces spiked whenever he issued commands, even when transmitted indirectly. His influence on the defenders produced measurable improvements in reaction time, accuracy, and overall combat performance. The final confrontation between the Emperor and Horus remains the most analysed yet most poorly recorded event in both Administratum and Mechanicus history. Administratum logs state that the Emperor's decision to teleport aboard Horus's flagship was based on a calculated necessity rather than impulse. Their operational projections concluded that no conventional military action could resecure Terra while Horus remained alive. Mechanicus sensor archives indicate that when the Emperor entered the Vengeful Spirit, the vessel experienced massive internal disturbances. Machine spirits across its system malfunctioned, power distribution networks destabilized, and multiple decks chronically failed in their gravitational alignment. These disruptions were attributed to an uncontrolled flux of warp and counter-warp energies radiating from the confrontation. Administratum after-action reports, though heavily redacted, described the Emperor's combat methodology during the engagement as focused, unrelenting, and absolute. They wrote that he fought not as a general or a ruler, but as the singular bulwark against the annihilation of humanity. Every action he took was driven by purpose rather than emotion. Mechanicus interpretations of the surviving energy readings suggest that his psychic output during this battle exceeded anything previously recorded. Their sealed files state that his combat potential was not simply a matter of destructive capability, but the ability to reshape the metaphysical structure of the engagement space, overpowering warp anomalies created by Horus. In the aftermath of the battle, Administratum reports noted the immediate collapse of enemy coordination across Terra. The death of Horus produced a destabilizing effect on the traitor legions, and the Emperor's grievous wounding defined the final phase of the conflict. Their analyses concluded that his last act, eliminating Horus despite the immense personal cost, was the decisive moment that prevented the Imperium's total collapse. Mechanicus evaluations focused instead on the consequences of his injuries. They determined that no known technological resource within the Imperium could fully restore him. The Golden Throne, originally designed as a vast networked system for psychic governance, became the only viable mechanism for sustaining his remaining life force. Their internal assessments classified this outcome as a systemic emergency, requiring continuous oversight to ensure the stability of Terra and the Imperium at large. Across all notable battles, administratum summaries converge on one core observation. The Emperor redefined the concept of warfare. His presence on any battlefield shifted the probability of victory to near certainty. His strategic decisions shaped the largest campaigns in human history, and his combat ability removed threats no other force could counter. For the administratum, he was the ultimate military constant, an inviolable variable that made victory calculable. The Mechanicus reached a similar conclusion. Their records describe him as a being whose mastery of psychic, physical, and technological domains placed him beyond any known template of human capacity. They studied his actions not as the movements of a warrior, but as the manifestations of a phenomenon they could not replicate. Even after millennia of research, their assessments remain unchanged. The Emperor, when engaged in battle, represented a form of controlled devastation that exceeded the predictive capacity of their most advanced systems. Though documented through different institutional lenses, both bodies of evidence present a unified picture. The Emperor's involvement in any conflict, whether during Unification, the Great Crusade, or the Siege of Terra, transformed the battles from conventional engagements into decisive historical ruptures. His fighting style, measured only through fragmented data and the testimony of those who survived the events, demonstrated a capability that neither the administratum nor the Mechanicus could fully classify. And in every engagement where he acted directly, the outcome became inevitable. Administratum addendum archives referencing the Emperor's early wars continue well beyond the commonly cited Unification and Crusade milestones. The lesser-known campaigns, though overshadowed by more iconic conflicts, reveal additional patterns in his operational behaviour. Many of these engagements survive only as fragmentary notes extracted from incomplete expedition ledgers or secondary data recovered by the Mechanicus from deteriorating storage devices. When pieced together, they depict a series of conflicts that reinforce his consistency as a strategic and combat asset far beyond any conventional measure. One of these lesser documented conflicts was the subjugation of the First Moon Enclaves during the closing phase of the Unification era. Administratum scribes recorded this event through outdated terrestrial satellites that stored incomplete footage of the Emperor's intervention. The Enclaves had fortified themselves with repurposed pre-Old Night aerospace weapons, creating a defense grid capable of denying access to all earlier Imperial attempts at compliance. It was only when the Emperor led the final assault that the resistance collapsed. According to the fragments recovered, he bypassed the densest clusters of automated fire with movements that were too precise to be categorized as random evasion. Administratum analysts described these actions as predictive traversal, implying that he navigated through the grid by anticipating the firing solutions before they were calculated. When the central control nexus fell, the Enclave leaders surrendered immediately, citing that they had witnessed something they could not rationalize. The administratum concluded that his presence removed the possibility of long-term defiance. In the earliest decades of the Great Crusade, several isolated engagements demonstrated similar results. The campaign against the Chimeric interference zones, located within a cluster of warp turbulent worlds, remains one of the most obscure. Administratum survey fleets repeatedly failed to establish stable records due to environmental corruption. Only when the Emperor arrived did the region stabilize enough for reliable data extraction. Mechanicus explorers documented that the warp anomalies surrounding the cluster condensed into more predictable patterns when he deployed onto the surface. This allowed the fleet to project coordinated force for the first time. The primary battle ended rapidly once the Emperor confronted the anomalous entities that inhabited the region. Mechanicus logs describe these entities as non-corporeal hostile forms, though their exact nature remains unknown. The Emperor dispersed them through an expression of force that created a sudden absence of all psychic signatures within the vicinity. The Mechanicus later classified the effect as an anti-anomalous field, though they admitted they had no theoretical framework to support such terminology. A later confrontation occurred on the world of Delphisa during one of the Great Crusade's mid-period compliance operations. Delphisa was home to a technologically regressed society that relied on colossal mobile fortress machines inherited from an ancient era. These machines possessed destructive capability significant enough to threaten an entire Crusade battle group. When the Emperor took command, he dismantled the largest fortress machine in a single decisive breach. Administrator military assessments revealed that his approach to the structure followed no known entry pattern. The breach occurred at a point that strategists had marked as structurally impossible to penetrate, yet when the Emperor struck, the machine's internal architecture destabilized at once. The Mechanicus teams dispatched to analyze the aftermath found that internal damage appeared to have originated from multiple directions simultaneously, though the Emperor had entered through a single point. Their internal review cited this event as another demonstration of multi-vector engagement capability, though they could not determine whether the effect was physical, psychic, or a combination of both. Additional records of the Emperor's direct involvement appear during the darkening years preceding the Age of Rebellion on Terra. Administratum Chronicles documents several internal uprisings where he intervened only briefly, yet each instance concluded the moment he appeared. In one case, the rebellion collapsed without any physical engagement. Reports from loyalist officers stated that once he arrived, the opposing troops laid down their arms, as though compelled by a force beyond simple intimidation. The Administratum concluded that his presence activated a form of psychological dominance that made resistance impossible. Mechanicus observers from the same period attempted to correlate this effect with measurable changes in cognitive or psychic fields, but failed to isolate a single consistent phenomenon. Their final notes describe his influence as an unquantifiable atmospheric shift, a phrase used reluctantly given their institution's reliance on measurable variables. The Great Crusade's progression produced additional battle records that emphasize the Emperor's role not merely as a combatant, but as a stabilizing axis for entire theaters of war. Campaigns across the Ghoul Stars, for example, left the Administratum with reams of corrupted data due to hostile environmental conditions. Yet among the few intact documents, a repeated observation emerges. Whenever the Emperor participated in an engagement within this region, the unpredictable anomalies characteristic of the Ghoul Stars temporarily subsided. Communications remained clearer, navigation became more accurate, and warp disturbances lessened. Mechanicus Logica engines suggested that his presence suppressed hostile warp fluctuations across wide radii, altering their behavior for as long as he remained active in the environment. Once he departed, the anomalies returned, often stronger than before. The aftermath of these smaller campaigns also produced logistical consequences recorded meticulously by both institutions. Administratum analysts observed that regions pacified by the Emperor tended to remain compliant far longer than average. The data showed that rebellions were significantly less frequent in zones where he had personally led the final engagement. Their conclusion was that his actions created a psychological impression that endured for generations. Populations that had witnessed his intervention firsthand tended to develop stable loyalty patterns even when Imperial presence later diminished. The Administratum categorized these zones as self-maintaining compliance sectors, a classification used sparingly and applied only to territories he directly influenced. The Mechanicus, by contrast, focused on the physical aftermath of his involvement. They recorded environmental anomalies that persisted long after the Emperor departed. In some battlefields where he had unleashed significant psychic force, the surrounding terrain displayed long-lasting stability despite previously hostile warp conditions. On the world of Heliosa, where the Emperor neutralized a warp fracture threatening an entire continent, Mechanicus field teams discovered that the fracture site remained dormant for centuries. Their research concluded that his intervention had altered the metaphysical foundation of the region. Though admiration was not a term often found in Mechanicus documentation, their notes implied that the event exceeded their understanding of warp physics by several orders of magnitude. In the wake of the Horus heresy, the aftermath was recorded with particular administrative precision. The Administratum observed that Imperial forces entering the post-siege recovery phase relied on the Emperor's survival as the primary stabilizing element. Their logistics models projected total collapse if he had not been preserved upon the Golden Throne. Even in a physically inactive state, his influence remained a measurable factor in the Imperium's continuity. Administrator morale analysts documented numerous cases in which worlds reaffirmed loyalty upon receiving word that the Emperor still lived, even without direct evidence beyond official communication. These responses reinforced the institution's conclusion that the Emperor's symbolic and psychological impact was as crucial as his military contributions. The Mechanicus reached a similar conclusion through a different lens. Their post-siege evaluations noted that the Golden Throne, though never meant to serve as a life-sustaining device, remained the only apparatus capable of maintaining his psychic presence. Their internal documents stated that his survival was a matter of maintaining the psychic architecture of the Imperium itself. They concluded that the warp navigational network, the Astronomicon, and the stability of the Imperium's psychic infrastructure were all tied directly to his continued existence. Though they refrained from theorizing on the metaphysical implications, they acknowledged that the Emperor's psychic output from the throne represented the most powerful continuous warp beacon in recorded history. As the Imperium advanced through the millennia following the heresy, the absence of the Emperor's physical presence created shifts documented by both Administratum scribes and Mechanicus archivists. The Administratum noted an increase in administrative rigidity as institutions attempted to compensate for the lack of direct guidance. Compliance rates across distant territories fluctuated more unpredictably, and their analyses repeatedly emphasized that no leader, military or political, could replicate the stabilizing effect the Emperor once exerted personally. They concluded that his physical absence imposed long-term strain on Imperial governance structures. The Mechanicus, focusing on operational data rather than cultural consequences, recorded a decline in the predictive accuracy of strategic analytics once the Emperor no longer appeared on battlefields. Their models could not account for the loss of a being capable of altering the course of entire wars through direct intervention. As their projections shifted, Mechanicus strategists classified the period following the heresy as entering a state of permanent instability. This term did not imply collapse, but rather the loss of the absolute certainty that his involvement once provided. When assessing the Emperor through the combined perspective of both institutions, a final pattern emerges across their countless records. The Administratum viewed him as the foundation of Imperial military certainty, a presence that transformed even the most hopeless engagements into solvable equations. His influence extended beyond strategy and warfare, affecting morale, compliance, population behavior, and political stability. For them, he was the central pillar of the Imperium's functionality. The Mechanicus, by contrast, regarded him as the ultimate anomaly, a being who exceeded all known biological, technological, psychic, and theoretical frameworks. Their research portrayed him not as an individual operating within a system, but as a phenomenon reshaping the system itself. Whether on the battlefield or upon the Golden Throne, his presence redefined what was possible, altering environmental, psychic, and logistical structures simply by acting within them. Together, their perspectives converge on a single conclusion. The Emperor, through both action and existence, became the defining variable of Imperial history. Every war he fought ended with irreversible consequence. Every battlefield he set foot on changed permanently. Every crisis he confronted reshaped the Imperium, and in the aftermath of his greatest sacrifice, both institutions recorded the same final reality. The Imperium could endure staggering losses, fragmented fleets, rebellious sectors, and the swelling threat of hostile powers, but it could not exist without the Emperor. His presence, once physical, now sustained through the mechanisms of the throne, remains the core upon which the Imperium's survival depends. The earliest attempts by Inquisition archivists to categorize the Emperor of Mankind followed the same methodology used for other anomalous entities, yet even the most disciplined record keepers struggled to define boundaries for a figure whose existence consistently exceeded every measurable threshold. Internal memoranda from inquisitorial data vaults describe how the first generation of analysts attempted to classify the Emperor through conventional psychic metrics, only to find that the measurements refused to stabilize. Instruments that were designed to quantify psychic amplitude often returned values that surpassed their calibration limits. Long-range detection augers produced harmonic distortions that persisted for hours after recordings ceased. Early observers concluded that any evaluation had to be made contextually, through patterns of influence rather than direct readings, because the Emperor's presence interacted with the material world in ways that eluded measurement. Across numerous archived testimonies, the Inquisition repeatedly notes that the Emperor's psychic signature behaved less like a singular organism and more like a vast field of psychic coherence. Instead of emanating from one specific point on the astral spectrum, it manifested as a layered network of impressions and currents that expanded over a wide spatial range. Some observers suggested that the Emperor's will was capable of existing in multiple loci simultaneously, allowing him to observe, guide, and influence distant regions of terror during the Unification period without any physical relocation. These impressions formed the foundation for later hypotheses that the Emperor possessed a degree of psychic distribution unprecedented among human or Xenos populations. The difficulty of forming a stable observational record became one of the earliest points of discussion within Ordo Malleus circles. Pre-heresy transcripts recovered from a sealed Inquisition vault on Terra record the accounts of psychers who were asked to provide subjective readings. These individuals often describe sensations of layered perception, as though they were confronted by overlapping presences that were both singular and manifold. Some described the Emperor's consciousness as overwhelmingly focused yet infinitely broad, a paradox that the Inquisition was unable to reconcile through empirical categorization. Others reported intense clarity, claiming that simply being in proximity to the Emperor sharpened their psychic focus, while simultaneously generating a sense of profound insignificance. These testimonies were later classified as unreliable due to the stress placed on the psycher's mental stability, but they were retained because similar patterns appeared in independent accounts across multiple continents and eras. Observers during the Great Crusade encountered additional phenomena that complicated classification efforts. Fleet-level psychers who served aboard early expeditionary vessels reported that when the Emperor led a campaign directly, fluctuations in the Imperium behaved with unusual predictability. Warp turbulence reduced in severity, and psychic anomalies that were common along long-range travel routes became significantly less hostile. It remains unclear whether this occurred because of the Emperor's direct intervention, or because the Imperium reacted to his presence as a stabilizing counterforce. Some inquisitors proposed that the Emperor acted as a natural dampening field, suppressing destabilizing psychic phenomena by sheer magnitude of will. Others argued that the warp perceived him as incompatible with its chaotic essence and reacted by receding rather than clashing with his presence. Fragments of inaccessible research from the Ordo Astartes indicate that the Emperor's biological form contributed to the difficulty of producing coherent measurements. His physiology, when examined by Mechanicum specialists, did not conform to human baselines. Cellular regeneration exceeded all known thresholds. Neural density, metabolic stability, and structural resilience each reached levels that surpassed even the most refined genetic augmentations. Several sealed Mechanicum transcripts, now under Inquisition custody, record that attempts to analyze the Emperor's neural architecture were quietly terminated because the readings produced patterns that did not align with any known biological or artificial schema. These findings were later declared irrelevant by official administratum historians, although the Inquisition retained the documents due to the irregularities present in their conclusions. Even the Emperor's interactions with time became a subject of internal debate. Some investigators noted that he demonstrated perfect recall across events that spanned centuries, yet maintained no visible signs of mental fatigue or chronological distortion. A few secluded reports suggested that his perception of time may have been non-linear, allowing him to anticipate future outcomes not through precognition, but through a form of heightened recognition that bordered on near omniscience. These observations were never formalized into official doctrine, yet the consistency of their appearance across multiple reports suggests that the Inquisition considered them plausible enough to retain within their sealed record clusters. The Emperor's behaviour during the unification of Terra offered numerous points of analysis for the Inquisition's psychological examiners. They noted an unusual balance between empathy and restraint. While capable of acts of profound compassion, such as safeguarding vulnerable populations during early wars against techno-barbarian factions, he also demonstrated a calculated willingness to employ overwhelming force when necessary. This oscillation created challenges for archivists attempting to categorize his motivations. Some hypothesize that the Emperor pursued a utilitarian approach, applying violence only when it served long-term stability. Others believed that his perspective operated on a timescale so vast that individual loss carried a different weight within his decision-making process. Additionally, the Emperor's direct interactions with the Primarchs provided a unique source of data that the Inquisition examined extensively. Observers noted that his demeanour shifted depending on which Primarch he engaged with, yet remained consistently measured. He projected authority without aggression, and offered guidance without sentimentality. A number of sealed transcripts record that some Primarchs perceived him not only as a leader, but as a mirror reflecting their own potential. This phenomenon, referred to informally by some Ordo Hereticus scholars as psycho-reflective resonance, was believed to be an intentional technique used by the Emperor to stabilize or motivate individuals whose psychic or psychological profiles required specialized handling. The theory remains unverified but continues to circulate within certain limited access vaults. The Emperor's command presence during the Great Crusade was another subject of intense scrutiny. Officers and remembrancers who accompanied his campaigns frequently described his ability to direct forces with near instantaneous comprehension of battlefield conditions. Reports note that he responded to threats before they fully manifested, repositioning units and redistributing supplies with a precision that defied standard strategic models. Inquisition tacticians reviewing these accounts concluded that his awareness extended beyond sensory perception, perhaps incorporating an additional layer of situational analysis that operated continuously and without detectable delay. This led to speculation that the Emperor possessed an internalized predictive faculty that surpassed any existing technology or psychic discipline. An additional area of inquisitorial interest concerned whether the Emperor exhibited signs of emotional variability. In most official accounts, his demeanor remained consistently stable, but a number of confidential sources describe rare moments of visible sternness or quiet disappointment. These instances appear in testimonies surrounding interactions with particularly volatile Primarchs, or during moments of extreme betrayal by allied factions. Analysts noted that although the Emperor seldom reacted outwardly to emotional provocation, his decisions occasionally demonstrated a depth of conviction that suggested an internal moral framework both rigid and compassionate. The existence of such a framework became a subject of debate within Ordo Sicarius circles, who sought to understand whether the Emperor's ethical code could be defined within existing philosophical structures or whether it constituted a unique system shaped by millennia of experience. The Inquisition also collected reports concerning anomalous events that occurred in the vicinity of the Emperor during the Great Crusade. Some involved sensory distortions experienced by witnesses who described seeing faint afterimages trailing his movements, as though their visual perception lagged behind the speed of his actions. Others involved auditory irregularities, such as the sudden cessation of ambient noise when he focused on a specific task. A group of psychers stationed aboard a flagship reported an unexplained clarity of thought whenever the Emperor passed through the command deck. These effects were documented repeatedly but lacked consistent parameters, leading Inquisition researchers to conclude that they were manifestations of the Emperor's psychic field interacting with the perceptions of nearby individuals. Another anomaly involved the Emperor's interaction with warp entities during campaigns that required direct psychic intervention. In rare encounters with hostile demons, observers reported that these entities exhibited signs of hesitation when confronted by him. Instead of attacking immediately, they appeared to retreat or fragment upon perceiving his presence. Some researchers proposed that this reaction stemmed not from fear, but from incompatibility, as though the Emperor represented a form of psychic order fundamentally resistant to the chaotic structure of the warp. The scarcity of direct observations prevented these theories from developing beyond preliminary notes, but the consistency of their descriptions led the Inquisition to retain them within secure vaults. The Emperor's presence after his interment upon the Golden Throne created a new category of complexities within Inquisition research. Administratum personnel tasked with monitoring psychic emissions from the Imperial Palace recorded that the Emperor's output increased and decreased in irregular cycles. These fluctuations did not correlate with external events in the material world, leading some researchers to suggest that internal dynamics within the palace or within the warp itself influenced the cycles. The Order Malleus expressed particular interest in this phenomenon, noting that the periods of increased activity aligned with moments when the Astronomicon displayed heightened luminosity. Attempts to interpret the nature of the Emperor's consciousness after his interment became a persistent challenge. Reports produced by the Ordo Astartes described the Emperor as maintaining communication with select individuals during moments of extreme duress. These communications were often described as flashes of insight, sudden clarity, or a compelling sense of direction. The Inquisition debated whether these experiences represented genuine contact or were merely psychological responses generated by individuals under strain. Yet the recurrence of these reports across independent sources prevented them from being dismissed outright. A moderate view eventually took hold, that the Emperor's will continued to express itself through subtle guidance, though the mechanism and extent of this influence remained unknown. One of the most persistent concerns recorded in sealed Inquisition documents relates to the potential consequences should the Emperor's psychic output diminish significantly. Analysts noted that the Astronomicon functioned as a stabilizing beacon essential for interstellar travel, and its weakening would create catastrophic logistical challenges. Additionally, the Emperor's presence was believed by many to help maintain psychic order within the Imperium, although this theory lacked definitive proof. Nonetheless, Inquisition strategists explored scenarios in which the Emperor's influence waned, and these simulations consistently resulted in widespread destabilization. Observations from the Inquisition also include instances where the Emperor's will appeared to assert itself against malevolent warp influences attempting to breach Terra's defenses. These events were often recorded as sudden surges of psychic energy detected by the Imperial Palace's instruments. Some analysts speculated that the Emperor was continuously engaged in efforts to prevent large-scale incursions from hostile warp entities. This hypothesis remained speculative, but gained traction due to the increased activity detected during periods of strong demonic presence elsewhere in the galaxy. Unexplainable findings continued to accumulate around the Golden Throne. Reports described faint manifestations of light or spectral resonance surrounding the device, accompanied by fluctuations in local gravity or temperature. These occurrences were sometimes dismissed as environmental anomalies caused by the massive machinery that kept the Emperor alive, but the Inquisition retained copies of the records because the anomalies followed no predictable pattern. The Inquisition's overall impression of the Emperor, compiled through centuries of observation and analysis, is of a figure whose existence cannot be understood solely through biology, psychic ability, or technological classification. He occupies a transitional space between human and metaphysical, exerting influence that defies conventional measurement. His actions during life demonstrated a clarity of purpose that the Inquisition continues to study, yet has never fully deciphered. Even after deathless internment, his presence remains an active force that shapes the trajectory of the Imperium. The Inquisition concludes that every attempt to confine his nature within academic categorization ultimately reveals new layers of complexity. The Emperor consistently eludes full understanding, not through secrecy or intent, but because his existence operates on a scale beyond the capacity of human analysis. The archived findings reflect a figure who remains the defining constant of the Imperium, not as a symbolic artifact, but as an ongoing force whose presence continues to influence reality in ways that remain partially understood and partially beyond comprehension. The earliest Inquisition attempts to catalogue battlefield anomalies associated with the Emperor of Mankind were quietly separated from conventional administratum archives due to their irregular properties. Even before the establishment of the modern ordos, proto-inquisitorial analysts during the Age of Reunification found themselves confronted by accounts that challenged physical law, logistical prediction, and conventional understanding of warfare. Many of these records were later sequestered into sealed vaults beneath the Imperial Palace, not because they posed a threat to Imperial doctrine, but because they were too inconsistent for public dissemination and too complex for the structured discipline of standard military historiography. Only Inquisition researchers were allowed to examine them, and even then under controlled review protocols. The earliest anomalies appear in fragmented transcriptions from the Unification Wars, recorded by observers who lacked the refined equipment of later millennia. These witnesses described instances in which the Emperor moved across battlefields with a speed that defied their understanding of human locomotion. Some observers claimed he crossed hundreds of meters in the time it took them to adjust their viewing lenses. Others reported that he appeared simultaneously in multiple locations across a combat zone, though these accounts may reflect confusion during high-intensity engagements rather than literal bilocation. Nonetheless, the consistency of these claims across different continents suggests that the Emperor's battlefield presence could not be mapped through straightforward physical observation. A sealed report generated from the Pan-Pacific Campaign contains an account from a remembrancer whose picked recording equipment malfunctioned whenever the Emperor directed psychic force against enemy warlords. The frames captured before and after these moments displayed clear detail, but the frames corresponding to the decisive strikes dissolved into harmonic distortions. Mechanicum analysts later determined that the damage did not originate from heat, shock, or electromagnetic interference. Instead, the patterns resembled those seen in devices exposed to extreme psychic feedback. This led to the hypothesis that the Emperor's exertion during specific engagements produced a resonance that temporarily disrupted recording equipment. Since the distortion occurred only during narrow windows of activity, researchers concluded that he regulated his psychic output with extraordinary precision, allowing him to unleash overwhelming force without causing widespread collateral disruption. Additional irregularities were identified during the Great Crusade. Expeditionary fleets recorded episodes in which temporal sequencing on localized battlefield chronometers appeared to experience minute delays or accelerations. These deviations never exceeded fractions of a second, and they occurred only during moments when the Emperor engaged in direct psychic confrontation with warp-active enemies. Ordo Chronos investigators reviewing these findings suggested that the Emperor's psychic output may have interacted with the fabric of localized temporal flow. The magnitude of these changes was small enough to evade broader detection, yet sufficiently consistent to be classified as a statistical pattern rather than random fluctuation. The phenomenon was never formally acknowledged by Imperial strategists, but the sealed Inquisition records treat it as a confirmed anomaly. Another sealed batch of reports originates from the Ulanor campaign, where multiple eyewitnesses described a moment in which an Orc war engine detonated before the Emperor made physical contact with it. While some interpreted the event as precognition or preemptive psychic action, forensic analysis suggested that the engine's power core failed due to structural stress that accumulated seconds prior to the final strike. The Inquisition concluded that the Emperor may have used psychic force to destabilize the device's internal architecture before visibly engaging, making the detonation appear spontaneous to untrained observers. This explanation was retained because it aligned more closely with known capabilities, although the report noted that the Emperor's ability to manipulate material structures so precisely remained unprecedented. Recorded encounters with psychic adversaries introduced further anomalies. During the confrontation with the witch cult on the world of Gyron Secundus, fleet records indicate that the planet's warp signature collapsed briefly when the Emperor subdued the cult's primary psyker. Standard models predicted that such an implosion should have produced catastrophic atmospheric shockwaves. Instead, the event manifested as a sudden stillness across the planetary surface, described by observers as a moment of absolute quiet. Sensors recorded no wind, no atmospheric disruption, and no electromagnetic fluctuations. The only measurable change was a temporary reduction in ambient warp resonance. Some Inquisition analysts speculated that the Emperor neutralized the psyker by severing the cult's link to the Imperium at its source, a method previously believed impossible without causing psychic backlash. The absence of collateral damage made these findings even more difficult to explain. Another category of anomalies appears in accounts of the Emperor's battles against Xenos forces. During one documented campaign against a psychic Xenos species, whose name remains redacted in sealed archives, Imperial troops recorded that the Emperor neutralized an entire formation of enemy psykers without any detectable warp discharge. Auspex arrays detected no spikes in psychic activity, and energy readings remained flat despite the immediate collapse of the opposing force. Investigators concluded that the Emperor used a form of psychic suppression that operated outside known sensory ranges, perhaps through frequencies or mechanisms that modern Imperial instruments cannot detect. This event became a central reference point in theoretical discussions concerning the Emperor's mastery over psychic disciplines that humanity has not rediscovered. The anomalies associated with the Emperor's interactions with demonic entities are among the most heavily classified. In sealed Ordo Malleus archives, transcripts describe encounters where demons appeared to destabilize upon perceiving the Emperor, dissolving into non-cohesive spectral forms rather than engaging directly. In some cases, these entities attempted to flee back into the warp the moment the Emperor directed his attention toward them. These observations suggested that demonic presence behaved unpredictably in his proximity, reacting as though his presence constituted a threat to their very coherence. Researchers proposed that the Emperor's psychic field exerted a stabilizing influence over real space that conflicted with the chaotic nature of warp entities, forcing them into dissolution rather than confrontation. This theory, while unconfirmed, remains the prevailing interpretation within sealed Inquisition circles. One of the most confounding battlefield anomalies concerns the Emperor's ability to inspire coordinated action across large military formations. Reports from the Great Crusade contain references to units acting with enhanced synchronization during battles led by the Emperor. These formations responded to threats with a degree of cohesion that exceeded their training. Communications logs indicate that some forces anticipated enemy maneuvers without receiving orders, responding in ways that mirrored the Emperor's broader strategic intent. Subtle fluctuations in local psychic fields suggest that the Emperor may have projected a form of strategic awareness to nearby forces, allowing them to align their actions with his perception of the battlefield. The Inquisition considered whether this constituted direct psychic influence or an emergent effect of his presence, but the matter was never resolved. Several sealed reports address what appeared to be the Emperor's capacity to manipulate the emotional states of Allied forces. Soldiers and Astartes who fought near him recounted a reduction in fear, an increase in clarity, and heightened focus even under overwhelming conditions. These effects were not uniform, but their frequency suggested a consistent pattern. Ordo Psychoner researchers proposed that the Emperor release subtle psychic impressions that stabilized morale, shielding troops from the psychological burden of war. This capability would have offered a significant strategic advantage, though it raises questions about the impact of such influence on long-term psychological resilience. The Inquisition ultimately classified the phenomenon as an auxiliary effect rather than intentional manipulation, although some sealed documents suggest that the Emperor could apply such influence deliberately when necessary. Another set of anomalies is associated with battles involving powerful warp-tainted foes. During one engagement on a world later sterilized by ordnance, observers reported that the Emperor halted a warp storm's expansion merely by directing his will toward the anomaly. while administratum historians attributed this to rapid environmental stabilization following the death of the enemy psyker controlling the storm, Inquisition analysts noted that the temporal sequence of events suggested the Emperor acted first. Atmospheric and warp readings indicated a sudden inversion of the storm's growth parameters, followed by a rapid collapse. Some researchers speculated that the Emperor imposed structural order onto the warp incursion through an exertion of psychic authority. The absence of destructive backlash supported this conclusion, as natural warp storm collapses typically produce severe spatial damage. One of the most enigmatic anomalies appears in a sealed transcript from the Great Crusade. During a campaign against a technologically advanced Xenos species, a human diplomatic envoy reported that the Emperor communicated with the alien leaders without using any audible language. The encounter took place in a neutral zone, and witnesses described an extended period of silence, during which both parties appeared to converse through non-verbal means. Following the exchange, the Xenos surrendered without resistance. The event was never publicly acknowledged, but the Inquisition preserved the account because it implied an ability to engage in communication beyond verbal or psychic channels. Analysts theorize that the Emperor may have projected meaning directly into the cognitive framework of the Xenos delegates. The mechanism for such communication remains unknown. Encounter reports during the Horus Heresy offer additional data, though these records are often incomplete or heavily redacted. One sealed report from an Imperial vessel positioned near Terra during the final days of the siege described fluctuations in the Astronomicon that coincided precisely with the Emperor's psychic engagement against the War Master. These fluctuations were recorded as patterned pulses resembling rhythmic sequences rather than random shifts in energy output. Some Inquisition researchers interpreted this pattern as a form of structured signal, perhaps a manifestation of the Emperor's psychic exertion, expressing itself through the Astronomicon. If this interpretation is correct, it would suggest that the Emperor's battle extended beyond the confines of the vengeful spirit and into the broader psychic network of the Imperium. However, due to the lack of corroborating data, this remains speculative. Other sealed accounts describe irregular anomalies during the Emperor's final confrontation with Horus. Telemetry recovered from a surviving custodian's armor indicated multiple spikes in warp activity that did not correspond to standard demonic signatures. These surges were brief yet intense, and their structure did not match any known psychic phenomenon. Inquisition analysts concluded that these readings likely reflected the clash of two immense psychic forces, though whether the anomalies originated from the Emperor, from Horus, or from the entities that empowered Horus remains unclear. What is evident is that the readings ceased immediately following the Emperor's final act, suggesting a sudden and total severance of the hostile power. Following the Emperor's interment upon the Golden Throne, documented encounters shifted from battlefield anomalies to phenomena surrounding the device itself. Palace custodians recorded irregular pulses of psychic energy emanating from the throne during periods of external conflict, such as major chaos incursions or significant warp disturbances. These pulses were often of brief duration, yet their timing aligned with critical moments elsewhere in the Imperium. While some argued that this correlation constituted coincidence, the Inquisition maintained records due to the volume of occurrences. Analysts concluded that the Emperor continued to interact with the wider galaxy in ways not fully understood. Furthermore, several sealed reports from high-ranking Inquisitors describe experiences in which the Emperor appeared to communicate indirectly through visions, sudden insights, or compelling impressions transmitted during moments of extreme duress. These encounters lacked consistency in form but shared key characteristics, including clarity, brevity, and an absence of distortion common to warp-generated hallucinations. While skeptics argued that such events were psychological responses to stress, others noted that the individuals involved often acted on the guidance they believed they had received, leading to significant strategic outcomes. These cases remain among the most debated entries within Inquisition vaults. The Inquisition also maintains records of unexplained battlefield successes attributed to the Emperor long after his confinement. In several wars against major warp incursions, Imperial forces reported sudden yet temporary surges in morale or clarity, occurring simultaneously across geographically distant battlefields. These surges were accompanied by minor fluctuations in the Astronomican's luminosity. Analysts propose that the Emperor may have exerted his will in response to critical threats, though the mechanism by which he would have achieved this remains uncertain. The possibility that he continues to influence large-scale events through subtle psychic signals has been considered but remains unverified. Additional sealed files describe rare instances in which Inquisitors encountered artifacts bearing unknown psychic signatures that resembled faint echoes of the Emperor's presence. These objects were typically found on worlds where the Emperor fought directly during the Great Crusade. While the objects themselves held no inherent power, they appeared to carry residual impressions that resisted classification. Researchers concluded that these impressions may have been imprints left by the Emperor's presence, though the process by which such imprints formed remains speculative. Across all recorded anomalies, a consistent theme emerges. The Emperor's role in warfare extends beyond physical action or psychic exertion. His influence permeates environments, alters outcomes, stabilizes reality, and shapes the perceptions of those around him. Whether these effects stem from conscious intent or natural consequences of his presence remains unresolved. The Inquisition continues to investigate these phenomena, though even after 10,000 years, many of the recorded anomalies remain unexplained. The compiled records of the Emperor's actions across the span of human history present an unsettling consistency, a pattern of intervention without acknowledgement, orchestration without attribution, and intention concealed behind layers of time-worn myth. Assembled within this sealed archive are fragments collected from countless recovered data slates, field transcripts, forbidden Mechanicus logs, purged ecclesiarchal drafts, and testimonies obtained through processes that, by inquisitorial standards, fall within acceptable parameters, yet would be considered extreme by any lesser authority. The figure emerging from this mosaic is neither the idealized divine presence proclaimed by the ecclesiarchy, nor the abstract principle of order described in secular texts. Instead, the Emperor appears as a phenomenon that resists classification, a singular entity whose influence stretches so far backward into humanity's prehistory that the boundary between natural development and purposeful direction becomes impossible to define. The oldest fragments indicate that prior to taking direct command of humanity's fate, the Emperor walked among humans without drawing attention, monitoring the species' development and intervening at critical junctures. These interventions were subtle enough that later historians attributed them to chance or anomalous advancement, yet the patterns suggest deliberate shaping. This period remains the most opaque portion of the Emperor's existence, not due to a lack of data, but because the data is inconsistent with natural historical progression. The technological leaps, sudden political stabilizations, and improbably timed extinctions of hostile subspecies all follow the signature of external guidance carried out with minimal disruption. For the Inquisition, this era represents the Emperor's longest and most intentional experiment, a species evaluated, corrected, and prepared without ever realizing it was being molded. The transition into the Age of Strife marks the first moment when the Emperor's actions became overt. Warp storms engulfed the galaxy, sanctioned psychers emerged at an unprecedented rate, and human civilization fragmented. While the majority of historical texts blame cosmic coincidence and warp turbulence, the internal analysis of Ordo Malleus specialists reveals a secondary pattern. The Emperor's emergence occurred precisely at the point when humanity would have been permanently lost without central leadership. That timing is statistically improbable. Multiple sealed reports imply that the Emperor tolerated humanity's suffering during the early strife to provide a moral and psychological substrate upon which a unified Imperium could later be built. Suffering became not a consequence but a necessary element of conditioning, preparing the population to accept centralized authority once the Emperor chose to reveal himself. Once the Emperor began the Unification Wars, the records become clearer but no less concerning. His neutralization of techno-barbarian warlords was executed with precision, that suggest foreknowledge rather than mere tactical superiority. Warlords with access to powerful psykers were targeted first. Those dabbling in warp manipulation were eradicated without negotiation, and regions prone to rebellion were pacified through forced restructuring rather than absorbed. The pattern resembles a systematic pruning of variables that could interfere with his long-term objective. Even the creation of the Thunder Warriors fits this logic. Unstable biological weapons designed not to survive the transition into the next era. Their termination was not an act of cruelty, but an operational requirement, ensuring no early generation super soldier carried the genetic instability that could compromise later projects. The Primarch project, viewed from the inquisitorial lens, represents the Emperor's most ambitious act of engineered destiny. Each Primarch embodies a curated expression of human potential, martial, intellectual, psychological, or ideological, yet all were designed to be ultimately subordinate. The scattering of the Primarchs remains one of the most contested events in Imperial history. The Mechanicus insists on warp-induced sabotage, the Ecclesiarchy attributes it to divine trial, and the Black Library files of the Eldar suggest interference from powers unnamed. However, certain Inquisition sources propose an alternate theory. The Emperor allowed the scattering to proceed despite having the power to prevent it. He may have concluded that raising the Primarchs within the cultural and environmental diversity of the galaxy would temper their inherent extremities. If this theory holds, the result was mixed. Exposure to alien wars, human dictatorships, death worlds, and pre-imperial microcultures produced leaders of immense capability but equally immense unpredictability. The Emperor's logic may have been sound, but the execution proved flawed, with consequences that reverberated into the Horus heresy and beyond. The Great Crusade stands as the clearest manifestation of the Emperor's intention, the reunification of humanity under a single secular empire, devoid of superstition, technologically ascendant and resistant to the warp's influence. Yet the internal conflicts documented during the Crusade indicate that the Emperor underestimated both the autonomy he had instilled in the Primarchs and the warp's ability to exploit their psychological fractures. The archival transcripts surrounding the Council of Nicaea present a particularly revealing moment. The Emperor's decree to restrict psychic practices, despite his own reliance on such abilities, suggests an attempt to delay humanity's confrontation with the warp until a more controlled environment could be established. He understood that widespread sanctioning of psychic development before the Imperium matured would lead to disaster. However, this decision alienated Magnus, damaged the cohesion of the Primarchs, and inadvertently contributed to the cascade of events leading to Horus's corruption. From the Inquisition's perspective, the Emperor's greatest miscalculation was Horus. The Warmaster was engineered to be the ideal executor of Imperial will, possessing charisma, strategic brilliance, and loyalty reinforced through countless shared victories. Yet those same qualities made Horus vulnerable to corruption, once exposed to a force capable of exploiting ambition and insecurity. The Emperor's trust in Horus was logical, even justified by decades of evidence, but it created a single point of catastrophic failure. The files recovered from Istvan III, Istvan V, and the Battle of Ulanor paint a portrait of a leader who, once compromised, had both the authority and military capacity to fracture the Imperium in a matter of months. Several sealed dossiers suggest the Emperor recognized this vulnerability long before the heresy, but believed Horus's loyalty to be absolute. Whether this was misjudgment or a calculated risk remains an unresolved question. The Siege of Terra stands as both the Emperor's downfall and humanity's improbable salvation. Despite possessing power beyond comprehension, the Emperor allowed Horus to approach Terra and did not abandon the palace even when its defences began to fail. The reason becomes clear through deeper analysis. The Emperor needed direct confrontation with Horus to sever the corruption at its source. The confrontation aboard the Vengeful Spirit was not a duel, but a metaphysical conflict fought across both material and immaterial planes. The Emperor emerged victorious, but at the cost of severing his physical autonomy. His ascension to the Golden Throne was not planned, yet he adapted the situation into a long-term strategic advantage. The throne became both a prison and a conduit, enabling him to maintain the Astronomicon, anchor humanity within the warp, and continue exerting influence, albeit in ways that remain difficult to measure. The modern Imperium functions under the assumption that the Emperor is an omniscient, omnipotent entity actively guiding humanity. In truth, the Emperor's condition is more complex. Reports from the Order Hereticus indicate that the Emperor's consciousness flickers between states of lucidity and vast, incomprehensible perception. The Astronomicon itself reacts differently depending on these fluctuations, suggesting that the Emperor exerts will when possible and simply endures when weakened. Yet despite these limitations, the Imperium persists, strengthened by the very mythology the Emperor once sought to eliminate. The ecclesiarchy transformed him into a god, and while this contradicts the Emperor's original objectives, the stability granted by this belief system is undeniable. Faith has become a weapon more powerful than any bolter, and the Emperor, despite rejecting divinity and life, leverages it as a pragmatic necessity in deathless existence. The Inquisition's final assessment of the Emperor must balance scientific observation, historical record, metaphysical analysis, and political reality. The figure preserved on the Golden Throne is a paradox, a being who rejected religion yet now thrives as its central icon, a strategist whose grand plan collapsed, yet who salvaged humanity's survival through sheer will, a leader who created weapons of war yet sought enduring peace. The most classified files indicate that the Emperor's ultimate intention was not dominion, but preservation. His empire was meant to shield humanity until it developed the capacity to confront the warp without succumbing to it. Whether humanity is closer or further from that objective remains uncertain. The rise of the Grey Knights, the expansion of the Adeptus Mechanicus, the persistence of chaos cults, and the increasing mutation of psychers all point to a species still trapped within the Emperor's unfinished design. The Inquisition concludes that the Emperor's greatest legacy is not the Imperium, but the psychological transformation of humanity. Under his influence, humanity learned to see beyond the material, to treat the warp not as myth, but as a battlefield, and to reshape its destiny through unity and sacrifice. Yet this same transformation birthed fanaticism, authoritarianism, and stagnation. The Imperium survives not because of its brilliance, but because of its resilience, an attribute the Emperor himself instilled across millennia. The Emperor's silence has become as powerful as his commands once were. His absence generates action, his wounds inspire devotion, and his immobility anchors a galaxy spinning at the edge of annihilation. In this way, the Emperor remains the architect of humanity's fate, even if the blueprint is fragmented. The final perspective of the Inquisition is neither praise nor condemnation, but recognition of necessity. The Emperor is essential, flawed, irreplaceable, and still enacting a strategy too large for even the greatest minds to fully interpret. To judge him is meaningless. To understand him is improbable. To serve the survival of humanity is the only path forward. The Emperor's story, when stripped of myth and viewed through classified files, paints him not as a god or tyrant, but as the first human who truly understood the scale of the threat facing the species. He responded as only such a being could, with precision, ruthlessness, and a willingness to sacrifice everything, including his own mortal form. Whether humanity can ever complete the design he began remains uncertain, but the responsibility has now shifted. The Emperor can no longer command the future, he can only illuminate it, and even that light flickers. Thus the Inquisition closes this dossier with a conclusion that is neither optimistic nor defeatist, but grounded in observation. The Emperor is the last constant in an age defined by collapse. His presence, diminished yet undying, remains the axis upon which the Imperium turns. As long as he endures, humanity endures, though both are locked in stasis. The future will depend not on the Emperor's return, but on humanity's willingness to act without waiting for him to rise. The files end here, not because the story concludes, but because this is the point at which the Inquisition accepts the limits of knowledge. The Emperor's truth is too vast for complete comprehension, yet every fragment confirms a single undeniable fact. Humanity's survival is still his will, even if the galaxy no longer hears his voice.